Well, hello and welcome to my channel, The Withered Fig Tree. My name is Randy Silva, and I've been doing live streams about the importance of the Holy Spirit for over 2 years now. And today I am continuing with a series that is called Spiritual Realities, and this is episode 4. So let's go ahead and get started. So the title of today's episode is Mysteries of the Brain. There is some new information I wanted to give you from last week, as well as in terms of a review, as well as a little bit of new information. I also want to remind myself, as well as the audience, why I am doing this series. The Bible, for sure, is our primary source of knowledge about God and the spiritual realm, but it doesn't answer every question that we have. Throughout history, people have reported experiences that I believe point beyond the physical realm. Individually, if you take each one of these experiences individually, then really all you get is uncertainty and a subjective experience of those various individuals. But if you combine them all and look for commonalities, generalities, then what you can find is that they collectively represent scarce experiential evidence concerning the spiritual realm. We wouldn't want to miss out on any sort of rare and scarce information. So that leads to this slide. How should we evaluate experiential knowledge? We've talked about some of these points again, but I do want to emphasize them. The scripture remains our foundation. Experience can inform us, but it does not establish doctrine. But where the Bible doesn't speak, and we can find some sort of a pattern of paranormal experiences throughout history, then that can be information that perhaps God is giving to us. We have to exercise discernment, that we should neither automatically accept these types of experiences from people or even ourselves, but also not automatically reject them. And we have to recognize our biases and our assumptions. It is easier to reject unusual, odd, paranormal, or consciousness-related experiences. For the people who have experiences, that unfortunately leaves them confused, isolated, even ridiculed in some cases. But if some of these experiences are genuine glimpses beyond the physical world, then ignoring them entirely would be a mistake. My goal isn't to prove any of these extraordinary types of paranormal or consciousness experience claims as true, but as we look through history and find commonality in some of the experiences that humanity and people within humanity have had, then I think we need to ask this question. If some of these experiences that repeat over time are genuine, what might they reveal about the spiritual reality that the scripture definitely tells us exists? Both science and Christianity, or just religious or spiritually minded people, have good reasons to be cautious. But my concern is that the caution should not be dismissal. If God occasionally shows rare glimpses into the spiritual realm, then those experiences deserve careful discernment, not automatic acceptance, not automatic rejection. Science and Christianity rarely agree on matters. It's not that they always disagree, but they rarely agree on matters. But in this case, in terms of paranormal and unusual consciousness experiences, they do tend to agree. And that means that this type of experiential knowledge faces a steep burden of proof. So if you think about science, generally prefers phenomena that are repeatable, measurable, and experimentally controllable. Rare subjective experiences are difficult to study, and often these phenomena are products of the brain and psychology anyway. So researchers tend to be cautious or dismissive. At the same time, though, if you think about it, if even one of these phenomena were convincingly demonstrated scientifically, it would have profound implications for neuroscience and our understanding of reality. Many Christians are concerned about deception, false teaching, and giving undue authority to experience. Since the Bible is sufficient for salvation and for our doctrine of how to live our lives, many are understandably reluctant to explore experiences that are not explicitly described in the Bible. And I would say as a result, these experiences are sometimes treated as though they are automatically unbiblical or deceptive, when if you think about it, the better term to use would be extra biblical, meaning outside of the Bible. So it's not that it violates the Bible, it's that it is information that comes from outside the Bible. And we shouldn't confuse those two things. And in terms of being deceptive, some of them definitely, some things are hoaxes or just, people being confused or something. But those types of experiences just require discernment. The fact that science and Christianity sometimes agree on the paranormal doesn't mean that it's not true. It's not the case, because we can see that in both cases, they have biases. They have their biases. It simply means that we should recognize our assumptions and biases and ask whether some experiences deserve thoughtful investigation rather than immediate dismissal. Secondly, up front, I want to talk about simulation theory. I mentioned that at the end of episode 2 that I was going to talk about it in episode 3. And then in episode 3, I kind of kicked that can down the road. The more I've thought about it, though, the less important I think it is to the overriding question of the series, which is, does this possibility meaningfully change our understanding of spiritual reality? There is an idea that we live in a simulation, that the reality, this corporeal existence that we exist, is actually some sort of very advanced, computer program. And sometimes that seems to even make more sense as our computers within what would be this simulation are becoming more and more powerful and able to create higher and higher fidelity simulations for ourselves to enjoy. The more I thought about it, though, I don't think it deserves an episode, so I just wanted to mention it up front here. I do think the answer is no. I don't think it changes our understanding of the spiritual reality. And the reason why is because whether the universe is fundamentally real or an unimaginably sophisticated simulation, our conscious experiences and our moral choices and the spiritual questions we've been exploring in this series remain essentially the same. If such a simulation exists, its creator would simply occupy the role we normally attribute to God. And a lot of times when we think of a simulation, we think of some young person living in their parents' basement with Cheeto dust on them or something like that. But that's definitely not the case with this simulation, if it is, that we're living in, because God shows great concern, great care for our well-being, both physically as well as our spiritual well-being now and in the afterlife. And so God isn't just some young person haphazardly operating some simulation. If there is a simulation, it's so much grander than any simulation we've created. I don't even know if humanity could create such a simulation. Maybe on a small scale it might be able to in the future. But nevertheless, it's the creator of that simulation would occupy the role of who we call God. And so rather than devote an entire episode to that possibility, I'd rather spend time examining, questions that do directly affect our understanding of consciousness and the spiritual realm. Comparing models of consciousness. Now, I brought this up last week, so this is a bit of a review, but I've also added a fourth model. Here are the 4 models. Here are the 3 from last week: materialist, integrated, and avatar. And then this new one, boy, I thought hard on what label to give it. The best one I could come up with is brain, then spirit. So this new model, in our life right now, our brain performs nearly all conscious processing, but then only after our lives have ended, then the spirit receives those experiences and passes them on to the spiritual realm. So you can kind of think of it, integrated is sort of a combination of the materialist and spiritual views. This one is also like that, but it is definitely different than the integrated one. So in the integrated model, the brain shapes or filters consciousness originating in the spirit. So it's the spirit that is behind the scenes driving our consciousness and our conscious experience. In the materialist view, of course, that's the simplest view. That's what scientists would say, or most scientists would say, that consciousness is entirely produced by the brain and there is no post-life consciousness. The brain then spirit model is sort of this first sentence. Consciousness is produced entirely by the brain, and the spirit, for the most part, is just something we carry along with us, but it doesn't have much of an impact or an effect on our physical relationship. It's just sort of kind of sitting behind the scenes. So that's what this part is. But then once you die, though, this part is not the case. It's not, there is no post-life consciousness. There is a post-life consciousness, and that is when the spirit takes over. And the spirit somehow, that's what I put in here, one of these challenges, it requires an unknown transfer of memories and experiences between the brain and the spirit. I don't know how that would work, but I'm sure God could figure it out. That it's when you die that your spirit then continues, and it continues with the knowledge and the experiences and the things that you've learned while you're on earth. And then, of course, the avatar one is that the brain receives consciousness from the spirit. And so that means, in this case, it's kind of a spirit-heavy model. The brain is really just an interface, and it really is the spirit behind the scenes who may even have additional information about reality, but is not allowed to communicate that to the body or something like that. So here I put the strengths and challenges of these different models. So if the materialist view works insofar as it explains science. It explains neuroscience, things like anesthesia, brain injury, and psychedelics, things like that. What it doesn't explain are these things that we are investigating in this series. Things like near-death experiences, extrasensory perception, apparitions, and other phenomenon. If those things are genuine, and that's why we look for good evidence, we look for good examples of them, and we look for a pattern that repeats over history, then this model has no explanation for those types of things. The integrated model actually explains both brain function and possible spiritual experiences. So all these spiritual ones in these rows 2 through 4, they all have a spiritual part of consciousness that extends beyond life. And so they can explain things that science has a difficult time explaining. But they are challenged by what we see in reality with how the brain works. So how the brain and spirit interact remains unknown. I don't think we will necessarily ever know that in this physical reality. But in the integrated sense, when there's things like brain damage, or we'll talk about this in the next slide, memory loss, things that strokes can cause, then these two middle models have a hard time explaining why it is that a person totally changes when something changes in their brain. If it is really the spirit that is important and that is receiving these things and just interfacing with the body, then why would things change so drastically or dramatically when the brain is damaged? I put here with the avatar that it easily explains survival after death and other spiritual phenomena, but it's harder to reconcile with the brain's overwhelming influence on consciousness. I would add to that things like brain damage. Brain then spirit, the scientists probably would disagree with the spirit, just they would say you're cheating. It's not fair. You can't have both worlds. But that's one of the reasons why I like this model, because it is really a materialist view in the beginning, but then after you die, then that is where things start to happen, or the spiritual realm can then be explained. But then specifically with times where you survive death, so near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences, that makes much more sense with this brain than spirit type of role, especially the near-death experience. So in that case, you almost die. And so this transfer of information occurs, but then you start to have a consciousness in the spiritual realm, like you see a tunnel, you see light, you see your loved ones who have passed, something like that. But then for whatever reason, God says, no, your time's not yet arrived, and so you need to go back. And so you go back into your body, and then now the transfer, I guess you'd say, goes the other way. So now the living person has knowledge of the spiritual realm. And so that appears to be what's going on with near-death experiences. Of course, science would just explain those as, your brain's last dying gasps before it's totally shuts off. But there's a lot of things that don't make sense about that explanation. Okay, so this is the slide that I have for today. So this is what we're going to cover in terms of new information. So the idea is to look at how our one experience in reality and then potentially into the spiritual realm. I would argue, yes, there is a spiritual realm. How do these 4 different models or interpretations handle different types of experiences. Now, most of these are brain disorders or maladies. If you look scientifically, brain disorders and brain damage have been scientists' greatest tool or view into how the brain works. Now, of course, if science has any sort of ethics, and hopefully it does, it won't, intentionally damage the brain so that they can figure out what parts do. That would be unethical, immoral. But when it just happens to happen, then science can use that. And certainly if the person is willing afterwards, to be probed and put into MRI machines and so forth, to maybe their brain injury that they had can help future people, then they're all that, a lot of times they're for that. And so science can learn a lot about the brain through brain injuries. But can they also expand our understanding of the spiritual reality? So there's this phenomenon called the split brain. It's pretty complicated, I guess you'd say. And with all of these, actually, I would, what's the word? Recommend. I would recommend, if these interest you, to do some research on them, because some of them are just fascinating. The split brain one in particular is very fascinating. So I believe it was in the 60s, maybe the 50s, in order to help people with severe epilepsy. So there is a connection between the left and right hemispheres of the brain. And before they started doing this surgery, science didn't know why are there two halves? Does it matter? That's just the way the brain grows. They kind of assumed that the brain functioning was balanced and not unique to one hemisphere. And that was proven totally incorrect. The brain, definitely left brain, has very many different functions than the right side of the brain. And so there's this connecting nerves between the two hemispheres called the corpus callosum. And during a severe epileptic seizure, then this I don't know what the word you use, but it's kind of like a short circuiting. I don't know. I don't want to use that word, but can cross over to the other hemisphere, and then it just expands the other hemisphere, and it can be very severe, and it can be life threatening. And so the thought was, we can cut this connection, and since the brain is pretty balanced in terms of its two functionality, the person, their epilepsy will be cured, and they hardly notice that this was cut. But that turned out to not be the case. Now, the person was able to go on living, and in a lot of ways, they were able to live their lives out just like normal people. And in I think on almost all the cases, it actually did cure their epilepsy. But they did find that the left and right hemispheres are radically different in what they do, and it has great impact on how the right side is no longer able to communicate with your conscious experience, I guess you'd say, or continuous conscious experience, because that connection is severed, and it can get frustrated not being able to communicate. Oh, it can't communicate, by the way, because they found out that the language center is handled in the left side of the brain, and logic is also handled in the left side of the brain. And so without that connection, the right side would get very, what's the word? I just said it. Not just confused, frustrated. That's the word I use. The right side of the brain gets very frustrated because it can't communicate things. Now, how does the materialist interpret this? It just says that there are two conscious processors that make up your full consciousness, and splitting them surgically, or maybe through some sort of accident that you have, excuse me, then that has a great effect on your experience of reality. Now, what does the integrated model says. It says that there's a brain spirit interface, but that it is divided, and that if you disconnect that, then it would influence how the spirit then has control over the brain. And it's really similar to the avatar in that case as well. One spirit is using a divided brain for different things, and if that connection is broken, then you can think of your avatar, your spirit, sitting in some other realm. Excuse me, my eyes itching. Your spirit is controlling your body, and it's like, oh man, I can't get this to work because these things aren't connected anymore, and so that will change the way it controls the body. The brain then spirit just simply agrees with the materialist view. It says the brain is divided, and then that will have an impact when you finally do die. It will have an impact on your experiences that get transferred to your spirit. But while you're in your body, these two columns are really the same. Now, schizophrenia is a neurological disorder that causes things like hearing voices and hallucinations. And it's really interesting. I remember watching a Jordan Peterson episode where he talked about how it's actually, you'd say, wow, it's crazy that some people have, or it's unfortunate that some people have schizophrenia. He says it's actually more unusual that not everybody has schizophrenia. So it turns out that your brain actually is hallucinating all the time. It is always trying to create a model of reality. And it's just when there's a certain disorder in the brain that those hallucinations don't match reality anymore. And now the conscious brain starts to actually see things that aren't there, or hear things that weren't actually there. So that's how the materialist view describes that. And it's probably, I would say, the same for all of these spiritual ones. Definitely this right column, for any sort of, experience, these kind of will match. But for the middle two on this one, it's also kind of the same thing. So I would say that schizophrenia is a brain disorder. And for these two models where the spirit is also involved with the brain, then that would be some sort of brain malady or dysfunction that causes the spirit to not be able to communicate well with the body. Now, I have two different things of brain damage. One is from memory and one is from personality. The memory one doesn't make sense first of all, it's very well proven that people lose their memory, not just through dementia, but that's also one of these things, or fits in this column or this row, but also through damage and things like stroke or injuries, impacts to the skull. So how, especially in the avatar model, how can the spirit, it doesn't make sense with the avatar. This is one of the biggest weaknesses of the avatar model, is that if the spirit is actually the one behind the scenes remembering things, then why can the conscious person no longer remember those things? Even if the brain is damaged, it doesn't make sense. And it's very similar to the integrated case. Does the spirit also lose these memories? So when you go to the afterlife, do you go with whatever memories you had available to your conscious self at the very end when you died? Because that would be unfortunate, especially if you have something like Alzheimer's, where you have no memories of reality, you totally forget them. And so then your spirit would have no memories, and that doesn't make sense either. So that is these two models those are weaknesses for this model. Now, there's also brain damage where it can affect your personality. There's a famous case of Phineas Gage. He was a railroad worker, and he had a bar get exploded straight through his head. Kind of graphic, but his personality totally changed. It totally destroyed the hypothalamus, and again, science didn't really know what this thing did, but it has a lot to do with your personality. So the materialist view again explains this very well. So does the brain then spirit view. But what are these things? What do these two models say? Why would your personality, if the personality is really a part of your spirit, then why would brain damage alter your your personality? These two models really struggle with that. So then there's split personality, or it's also called dissociative identity disorder. They keep changing the name of it. It used to be called multiple personality disorder. But materialists just explain that as you had some sort of traumatic upbringing, something very terrible that happened to you or continued to happen to you when you were young. And so your brain created ways to cope with that. And unfortunately, one of those ways is that you end up with multiple personalities that sort of take the wheel at different times, sometimes have communication with each other, other times don't. So really, again, you should look this up because it's very interesting. So how does that explain these two models? Why is it like these models might actually say that the person is possessed with multiple human spirits, but then that wouldn't make sense because, like if one of the personalities gets saved, believes in Jesus, does that mean the other ones are saved as well? So those models would struggle with this type of idea with split personality. Whereas with the brain then spirit, you would have this fragmented processing in the brain with these different people that have been created to handle things. But when you die, those experiences get transferred to the spirit, the one spirit, and then you go into the afterlife. I don't know if I've ever heard of somebody with split personality disorder having a near-death experience. That would be really interesting to investigate. So I have here déjà vu and premonitions. I put them in the same category because I think they're the same. From the weak side of the weak experience of déjà vu, which I think just about anybody has, they just feel like they've been somewhere before. You kind of get in a situation like, I swear I've been here before, but you're like, I've never been here before. Premonition is more like you have a feeling that something's going to happen and then something bad does happen, or maybe you have a dream about something that's going to happen about the future and then it does happen. And I think déjà vu is actually linked to that people that have stronger senses of déjà vu have premonitions, basically very short premonitions that then can come true in the moment. And then when it happens, they're like, oh my gosh. For me, this is one of the things that I experience. And for me, it always feels like I have dreamt this. It's a short period of time. And a lot of times when I say out loud, oh my gosh, I dreamt this, that's actually part of the dream. The materialist view is that this is just a memory error, a coincidence, some sort of subconscious pattern recognition that's going on. Memory error meaning something to do with short-term and long-term memory. That kind of makes sense and why I would feel this way. But I have had, at least in one case, a time where I dreamt something was going to happen and then changed my behavior the next day. It had to do with riding a bike. So I was trying to learn how to ride a bike. So I was really, nervous about riding a bike. And so I just said the next day, all right, time to take the training wheels off. I'm ready for it. And then when my dad did that, and I went down the yard, he's kind of following me like, you can kind of imagine the father-son kind of experience with a kid on the bike trying to ride. It happened exactly as I had dreamt it. I have no explanation for that. No explanation for that. I've had several other déjà vus that have been like that. Most of the time they're not, but I have no explanation for it. And the materialist view would have no explanation for it. But these spiritual views would all say that there is a rare time where the spirit kind of is able to take its head or its presence out of the body for a moment and look forward into time to see what's happening. And so this is one of these cases where these models shine. Now, psychedelics is a strange topic. Some people have experienced psychedelics. I have not. But they really alter your brain chemistry and they really alter your perception of reality. You see hallucinations, you see colors. These are not just normal drugs, normal, if that's a word, like cocaine or methamphetamines. These are more like LSD or DMT, and they affect how you perceive reality. And for the most part, what they do is turn off these barriers between parts of your brain that normally do not communicate suddenly are able to communicate. And because of that, the materialist view would say you just see weird things because of that. But in these spiritual views, it's possible that, not recommended, but it's possible that the the tight connection between the body and the spirit sort of loosens, and then the spirit is able to maybe see into some other realm or something like that. Maybe you don't like what you see. A lot of times people will say they see demons and things like that, or see terrible things happening. But and sometimes they get really sick. So a lot of these circumstances or these experiences are, I guess you'd say, not good, but some of them are good. And especially in cases of people that have PTSD or have extreme phobias about fear of death, that especially the one that I mentioned last, DMT, can solve those things. That people suddenly no longer have a fear of death or no longer have a fear of this terrible experience that they had, that they have this post-traumatic stress disorder over. So these three spiritual models can have an explanation for how psychedelics affect the brain outside of just altered brain chemistry. Thanks again for joining me this evening. And remember to like and subscribe. Next week, we will start talking about spiritual experiences that have happened throughout history, and also look for patterns in those and see what they might reveal about the spiritual reality. Have a great evening.